Hello there.
You've done enough for today. You're safe now. Let's set aside the rush of thoughts, the long to-do lists, the what-ifs, and the when-wills. Let your mind soften, and your shoulders settle into whatever holds you. And now, let's drift together, back in time. It's autumn. The year is 1812. And somewhere between the wide boulevards of Paris and the windswept plains of Eastern Europe, there is a quiet story unfolding. One not of gunfire or glory, but of fabric, of buttons and boots, and a promise made of wool that never quite arrived. This is the story of a coat, or rather, the story of thousands of coats. Coats that were cut, measured, dyed, and imagined, but that never found their way to the men who needed them most. Let's begin gently, in the candlelit workshops of a weary capital. Paris, in those years, was a city of both brilliance and exhaustion. Napoleon Bonaparte, self-declared Emperor of the French, had reshaped nearly every institution: military, political, and even cultural. And at the heart of his empire pulsed a machine of war so vast, so confident, that it seemed invincible. But not all victories are won on the battlefield. Tucked away in side streets and crooked alleys were the little rooms where France's grand military dreams were stitched, one seam at a time. Men and women hunched over bolts of wool, their hands stained with indigo dye, their needles glinting in candlelight. They weren't soldiers, but their work would march 1,000 miles. Tailors, seamstresses, dyers, warehouse scribes. Have you ever watched someone sew by candlelight? The way the flame flickers over the fabric, the rhythm of the needle rising and falling, the slow, patient breathing that accompanies it? There's a kind of intimacy to it, a rhythm older than war itself. In one such room, just off the Rue Saint-Denis, a man named Lucien pinched a swatch of coarse wool between his fingers. He frowned. It was too thin. The shipment from the looms at Rouen had arrived late and rushed. Not enough lanolin left in the fibers, no weight to it, not for what was coming. He didn't know precisely where the coats were going, only that they were for the east. But even then, whispers drifted through Paris like autumn leaves. Russia, a new campaign, a grand one. And yet, the stores were already strained. Wool, always wool. Good French wool was growing scarce. British blockades had done their quiet work, not with bombs, but by choking trade. And what cloth did arrive came in muted browns and sad grays, not the proud indigo blue prescribed by the emperor's regulations. To fix it, dyers had tried new recipes: crushed berries, imported indigo, boiled copper. But dye is a delicate alchemy. In one failed batch, 1,000 coats turned the color of slate before the fabric split in the cold. So they patched, they mended, they cut corners, and all the while, numbers piled up on dusty ledgers. 600 greatcoats, then 1,000, then 5. Somewhere in an office just above the warehouse floor, a clerk dipped his pen and wrote, "Completed, 7,400 greatcoats, destined for the First Corps." But the ink was hopeful, because even as he wrote, the carriages meant to carry those coats eastward stood still. Wheels cracked, horses dead, drivers reassigned to more urgent matters. Coats cannot march on their own. Now, far from Paris, the Grande Armée was already on the move. Hundreds of thousands of men, a living river of cloth and steel, stretched across fields and rivers and forests, surging toward the uncertain heart of Russia. If you close your eyes, you might hear them. The crunch of boots on frozen mud, the muffled jangle of gear, the quiet coughs, the breath white against the air, and everywhere the wind, sharp, insistent, cutting through threadbare sleeves. Not all soldiers were equal. Officers had fur-lined cloaks, and cavalrymen could wrap themselves in saddle blankets. But the foot soldiers, the ones who walked and walked and walked, they had little. They were told greatcoats would come, replacements, resupplies. They always came, eventually. So they waited and wore what they had. They stuffed straw into their boots, bound scarves over thinning uniforms, and shared coats when they could. In the mornings, frost made their coats glitter. Beautiful, in a way. But beauty isn't warm. There's a letter, faded, stained, from a soldier named Etienne, written in early October. He says, "We have burned the fence around the village for warmth. Henri walks with a limp now. He dreams of soup every night, and we are told the coats are only a week behind us." But days passed, then weeks. The coats were not behind them. They were scattered. Some were in wagons sunk into Polish mud. Some sat unopened in warehouses near Vilnius. Others, never made at all, remained only as numbers in misplaced ledgers inked by sleepy scribes long since dismissed. Logistics is not a glamorous part of history, but it is where armies succeed or fall. And here, in the cold and silence of an eastern winter, it was failing. Not with a bang, but with a slow, fraying unraveling. Back in France, the factories tried to catch up. One overseer, in a report to the Ministry of War, noted, "Due to recent mildew in our warehouses, a shipment of 3,200 greatcoats has been deemed unfit. The dye has run. The lining is too thin. The wool has stiffened and cracked in storage." He proposed using felt instead, or linen. But linen is no match for frost. By December, Napoleon's army, once over 600,000 strong, had been worn down by snow, starvation, and silence. Coats were taken from the dead, stripped and shared. Some men tried to make cloaks from tent canvas. Others wrapped themselves in pages torn from field manuals. And still, the promise of the greatcoat remained. There's a kind of quiet despair that comes not from catastrophe, but from the small failures that add up, like water seeping into a boot, or a missing button that lets the cold creep in. Have you ever wondered how much of history is shaped not by bold choices, but by missing shipments? It's easy to talk of generals and battles, but the foot soldier remembers the hole in his glove, the tear in his coat, the wind. Napoleon himself wore a greatcoat of gray, thick, elegant, with a high collar and braided closures. It became iconic. Painters would later depict him wrapped in it, staring toward the horizon, a figure of stoic strength. But his men often had none. And when the retreat from Moscow began, it was not just the snow they feared. It was the waiting, the hoping, the longing for warmth that never came. At Smolensk, soldiers found a depot. Inside, salted meat, hard biscuits, some rusted muskets, and 50 coats. 50 for thousands. There are stories, whispered, perhaps exaggerated, of men trading gold coins for a sleeve, fighting over a single wool blanket, sewing together scraps from abandoned uniforms to wrap around their children. For yes, Some soldiers had brought family, thinking it would be brief. One old man, too weak to walk, was wrapped in horsehide and left by a dying fire. Before they left him, someone tucked an empty sleeve around his shoulders, a gesture of dignity. Eventually, the greatcoats did arrive. Some reached Vilnius, some reached Warsaw. Many were never worn. They sat in crates, unopened, snow-dusted. By then, the army had shrunk to a shadow. Of the hundreds of thousands who had marched east, only a fraction returned. And among the many reasons, frostbite, hunger, exhaustion, there lies a quiet one, easily overlooked. They were simply cold. In the years after, military historians debated tactics. Logistics officers rewrote procurement protocols. Tailors learned to line coats with new materials, camel hair sometimes, and France rebuilt its army. But for those who survived, the memory of that winter was not of battles, but of cold fingers, stiff cloth, empty promises. Back in Paris, Lucien, the tailor, continued his work. He stitched new uniforms, he measured new recruits. But every so often, as snow fell gently past his workshop window, he would pause. He would remember the roll of thin wool he once rejected, the one he was told to use anyway. And he'd wonder whose coat had never come. It began not with cannon fire, nor with thunder on the horizon, but with a sound so small it could barely be heard at all. A faint crack, a quiet snap, a button slipping loose from a greatcoat and falling almost delicately into the snow. The kind of sound a person might not even notice, or if they did, might dismiss it as nothing. Just a thread frayed, just a button gone. But that sound, soft, brittle, forgotten, would come to echo through the long and frost-bitten silence of an empire at war. And now, as you rest your eyes and let your breathing slow, I invite you to imagine this sound, faint, cold, almost like the soft breaking of a dry leaf in winter. It was the sound of tin slowly dying. Let us travel back now gently to the early 19th century, to the year 1812, to a world painted in muted hues of brown wool and brass buckles, horse-drawn wagons and rows of infantry boots trampling over frozen ground. Picture an army, immense and disciplined, stretching across the vast canvas of Eastern Europe. It is Napoleon's Grande Armée, a force of nearly 500,000, pressing ever deeper into the Russian wilderness. But rather than battle and bloodshed, we will drift our focus towards something smaller, something quieter, to the uniform, to the coat, to the button. The buttons were made of tin. At first glance, this might not seem important. Buttons are humble things, utilitarian, overlooked. But, like so much in history, their quiet role belied their silent power.
Now, tin is a soft, silvery white metal. It melts easily, is resistant to corrosion, and in moderate climates, it serves its purpose well. For centuries, it was used in everything from pewter cups to organ pipes to uniform buttons. Soldiers wore it on their chest and sleeves without giving it much thought. It gleamed faintly in sunlight and gave structure to coats. It helped hold a man together.
But here is where our story begins to shift and deepen. Tin, you see, carries within it a strange secret, one that lies dormant until the temperature drops low enough to wake it. A transformation, slow and quiet, like a sickness that creeps beneath the skin. Scientists call it tin pest. At temperatures below 13.2 degrees Celsius, and especially when it falls below freezing, tin begins to change. its atomic structure rearranges. The metal turns from a shiny metallic form known as beta tin into a dull powdery gray form called alpha tin. This transformation is subtle at first, but then suddenly the once solid metal becomes soft and crumbly, like damp chalk. It disintegrates. This was not well known in 1812. And so, as Napoleon's army marched eastward, coats buttoned tight against the wind, boots crunching over frost-covered soil, no one paid much attention to the buttons. Why would they? There were grander things to worry about: food rations, maps, horses, weather, and war. But then the air grew colder, the nights grew longer, the frost deeper. And one morning, a soldier reached down to fasten his coat and found that the button had cracked. Another found his sleeve open. Another, his trouser flap unmoored, flapping lightly in the biting wind. And another, many others, discovered that their buttons had turned to powder. Tin Pest had begun its slow, silent work. Can you picture it? A row of soldiers shivering at dawn, trying to button their greatcoats, only to find the buttons breaking away in their hands like dried mushrooms. White powder gathering at the seams, the dull grit of it against their fingers. It must have felt absurd at first, then troubling, then demoralizing. Imagine how many times each day a soldier touches a button, to adjust, to fasten, to refasten, to secure. These were not decorations, they were tools. When they began to fail, the consequences rippled outward. Coats gaped open, gloves fell, gaiters loosened, breeches slipped. The cold crept in through every crack, every seam. And there was no easy fix. Some men tried to tie their coats shut with cord or twine. Others salvaged buttons from fallen comrades. A few turned to wooden substitutes, carved roughly from crate lids. But these were temporary measures at best. The uniforms, which once stood for discipline, identity, and order, were unraveling. And with them, something less tangible was coming undone too. Morale. It is easy, in the broad sweep of history, to overlook the small things. But sleep now and think gently on this. How many lives were changed by something as small as a button? How many frost-bitten fingers might have been spared if the coats had stayed closed? How many sleepless nights might have been warmer had tin not betrayed the men who wore it? The march into Russia was brutal in ways both grand and minuscule. Historians have written volumes about the strategy, the weather, the retreat, but they rarely pause to speak of the tin. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was invisible, quiet, crumbling quietly in the cold. Let us linger here for a moment longer. Tin Pest is a curious thing. It is not fast, it creeps. The transformation can take days, even weeks. It begins in spots, often unnoticed. One button on a sleeve, then another at the collar, then 3 at the chest. All the while, the cold deepens. The metal grows brittle. The structure collapses. And what's most curious and oddly poetic is that the transformation is irreversible. Once tin turns to dust, it cannot be turned back. No amount of warmth will restore it. It is gone. This quiet collapse spread through the army like a shadow. Not a killing blow, but a wearing down. Like water against stone, like doubt in the mind. It made the soldiers feel exposed, vulnerable. And in the bitter Russian winter, that feeling could be deadly. Imagine now the sound of wind, A long, dry wind over snowfields and bare branches. Picture a soldier, young, lean, tired, pulling his coat tighter only to feel the flaps swing loose again. He curses under his breath, not because of the war, but because of a button. A single, stupid button that has failed him. And then he walks on, half-buttoned, half-defeated, the snow stinging his skin. Now imagine that same soldier weeks later, dirt-streaked, frozen, his coat patched with scraps, his uniform more memory than reality. He walks not with a march, but a shuffle, each step a question. Will this one hold? Will that one break? The buttons are gone, the tin has turned to dust. We do not often think of metal as perishable, but tin is one of the few metals that dies of cold. Most metals become brittle, yes, but tin transforms. It becomes something else. It decays from within, like a slow forgetting. And perhaps that's a fitting symbol for the Russian campaign itself. A march that began with certainty, with brass bands and banners, and ended in silence, in loss, in fragments. The Grande Armée entered Russia with nearly 500,000 men. Less than 1/5 would return. Was it tin that defeated them? Number not by itself, but it played its part, quietly, invisibly. As each button fell, as each seam split, the soldiers became more vulnerable to cold, to despair, to the endless whiteness of the steppe. And so, as you drift further into rest, let yourself think softly of the little things, of buttons, of metal, of cold, of how history is not only shaped by kings and cannon fire, but by the quiet decay of something as humble as tin. Close your eyes and imagine those tiny gray fragments, like dust from another world, scattered in the folds of wool. Think of the men who wore those coats, who once stood in rows, their buttons gleaming, only to find themselves unfastened by the chemistry of winter. There is a lesson here, perhaps, or maybe just a story of metal, of cold, of soldiers, and of silence. And maybe that's enough. Sleep well, the night is quiet now. You may find yourself settling into stillness, the air gentle around you, your breathing slow, the weight of the day gradually dissolving. As you close your eyes or simply soften your gaze, let's take a quiet step backward in time. Not into the clamor of war, but into its waiting rooms. Into the quiet, paper-filled corridors where wars were planned not with swords, but with ink and numbers, and with an almost religious devotion to counting. It is the winter of 1811, edging toward 1812. And somewhere, between Paris and Warsaw, between the cold creak of wooden floors and the rustle of wool uniforms brushed against ledger books, there is a man sitting at a desk. He is not famous. His name is likely lost to time, but he is one of Napoleon's quartermasters, an officer of the Grande Armée, and his world is not one of roaring battle cries, but of silence. Deep, bureaucratic silence. The kind where a ticking clock and the scratch of a quill can fill a room more completely than 1,000 voices ever could. You can picture him now, candlelight flickering over sheets of parchment, each one lined with numbers, columns, annotations. His eyes are tired, perhaps, but steady. His uniform isn't decorated with medals. His battlefield is a storeroom. His weapon is a pen. There's a soft snow falling outside. The flakes dust the windowsill, hush the world beyond the walls. The fire in the corner fireplace has burned down to low embers. But still, he sits, the ink on his fingers slightly smudged, the candle wax dripping slowly, counting time like an hourglass in reverse. He is tallying boots tonight. Not the boots you or I might wear, but the military-issue marching boots worn by thousands upon thousands of men. Boots made of thick leather, hand-stitched by suppliers from Lyon, Turin, Brussels. Some are new, others are patched and issued again. He must account for them all. Pairs, singles, left foot only, boots lost to swampy roads, boots requisitioned by cavalry, boots that simply disappeared. His list runs long. Boots for the I Corps, he murmurs softly under his breath, marking a line. Second Corps, pending delivery from depot. He doesn't look up. The ink is drying quickly in the cold. Time matters, because something is coming. Not tonight and not tomorrow, but soon. A grand invasion. Something unlike Europe has ever seen. Something colossal. The Emperor himself, Napoleon Bonaparte, is planning to lead over 600,000 men across the Niemen River into the vastness of Russia. But before any of that can happen, someone must count the buttons. And that someone is him. Or rather, dozens of him. Quartermasters stationed all across the growing empire, from Holland to Bavaria. Men in dusty storage rooms, in candle-lit offices, poring over supplies with the intense solemnity of monks copying scripture. Ink-smudged fingers and frayed nerves. Ledger books bound in rough cloth. Wooden crates sealed with wax. Stacks of copper pots. Bales of woolen cloth. Nails. Needles. Horseshoes. Bridle buckles. Tinder boxes. Tin cups. Musket flints. Lint bandages. Gunpowder casks. Axes. Shovels. Thread. Even writing quills had to be counted. Because an army doesn't just march on its stomach. It marches on details. How many shovels for trench digging? How many tents for each battalion? How many oxen to pull each mobile bakery cart? How many loaves of bread can be baked in a day? How long before flour spoils on the road? He makes a note in the margin of one long list. Check salt pork barrels. Some are leaking. His candle flickers again. Somewhere not far, perhaps in another cramped quarter, a younger clerk is poring over uniforms. Each blue coat is assigned a serial number. The brass buttons must gleam. The cuffs must be dyed the correct color to indicate regiment. He takes pride in the order. There's a quiet joy in folding a tunic just so, in laying it into a trunk, like tucking in a child for the night. He hums as he works, a little lullaby under his breath. He doesn't know, how could he, that these uniforms, so carefully counted and packed, will someday hang in tatters from the bones of starving men, lost in the Russian snow. But that is not tonight's story. Tonight, everything is in order. And yet, beneath the numbers, beneath the calm, there is something else. A tension. A strange sort of breath-holding that no one dares name. Because the invasion of Russia, oh, it will be grand, they say. It will be decisive. But deep down, even the most hardened quartermaster knows that Russia is unknowable. Its scale is different. Its seasons do not forgive. Its roads vanish in mud. Its villages, sometimes, do not exist where maps say they should. And so, they prepare, not in the spirit of triumph, but in the rhythm of ritual. Every crate nailed shut is a kind of prayer. Every receipt signed, a whispered hope. Do you know how long it takes to pack for 600,000 men? Napoleon's invasion force, when it finally marched, would carry over 130,000 draft animals, tens of thousands of wagons, entire mobile bakeries, portable forges, ammunition carts, medical wagons, field hospitals in boxes, and yes, Buttons, thousands upon thousands of buttons. Brass, tin, pewter, carefully packed in linen sachets, labeled by size and purpose. Because a button can decide a soldier's fate. A torn coat in the Russian frost is a death sentence. A missing fastening leaves skin exposed to wind that flays. Isn't it strange to think that so much human thought, so much energy, could go into something so small? But such was the task of Napoleon's logisticians, to consider everything, to leave nothing to chance, to prepare not just for war, but for weather, for wear, for time, and for the stubborn unpredictability of the human body. Imagine the crates, stacked high like silent sentinels in a warehouse in Vilnius or Dresden. Rows upon rows of iron nails, canvas tents folded into rectangles, handwritten manifests tucked between boards, ropes coiled like sleeping snakes. Imagine the musty scent of wool and wax, the squeak of wagon wheels as they're tested for fit, the low whistle of a clerk testing the tension of a saddle strap, the slight clatter of metal spoons counted out in lots of 50. It is a quiet world, this prelude to war, and yet it is where wars begin, not with drums, but with numbers, with patience, with preparation. You may wonder, why spend so much time counting? Because Napoleon believed in speed, in overwhelming force, in movement that stunned and suffocated. But speed is not born on the battlefield. It is born in the storeroom. It is born in the slow, methodical days when no one is watching. And so, the quartermasters counted. They counted for days, for weeks, for months. Sometimes they counted things that hadn't even been made yet. Procure 100,000 sheepskin pelisses for winter use, one order read. But the pelisses didn't exist yet. There weren't enough sheep or time. And yet, the line was written. Because sometimes, when facing the impossible, the human response is to make a list. And so they listed. Field kitchens, 480 units. Salt pork, 2 million rations. Shoes, 900,000 pairs. Horseshoes, 2 million. Cannonballs, 400,000. Tin buttons, exact number unknown. You can hear the pages turning, can't you? That gentle rustle of hope dressed as paper. Outside, the snow keeps falling, soft and slow, just as it did in 1811. You can almost feel the chill in the air, the way the wool coat warms your shoulders, the scratch of it at your neck. The quartermaster stretches his fingers, stiff from writing. He stands, walks to a cabinet, retrieves another ledger. The bindings creak. Tomorrow he'll count the powder horns. Tomorrow he'll tally the number of wagons needed, just to carry oats for the cavalry. Tomorrow he'll revise his inventory of tent pegs. Somehow, always, they go missing. And yet, tonight, he is proud. His world is in order. The ink is dry. The ledger's balanced. He closes the book with care, ties the cloth strap around it, and places it in a wooden drawer. And outside, beyond the quiet walls, beyond the candle's gentle glow, the world waits. The roads wind eastward into uncertainty. The Russian forests breathe deeply, unaware, or perhaps very aware, of what's coming. But for now, there is still time. Time to prepare. Time to count. And as the quartermaster blows out his candle and closes his eyes, he dreams not of glory or fire, but of numbers. of lists well kept, of crates neatly labeled, of a world where everything has its place, and every soldier has a coat, and every boot fits. In the end, it is the calm before history moves, the silent breath drawn in before the storm. And you, dear listener, may drift gently with it, into the hush of numbers and paper and candlelight, into the quiet rhythm of order, the inventory before invasion. Soft winds carry the scent of wet grass and charred firewood through a sleepy military camp tucked beneath a pale European sky. The distant clang of iron against iron fades into the soft hush of men settling down after a long march. Somewhere amid the stillness, between stacked muskets and canvas tents heavy with morning dew, there is a quiet, persistent rhythm. Not the march of soldiers or the gallop of messengers, but the gentle tap-tap of a hammer on leather. You might not notice it at first. It hides behind the noise of history, buried beneath tales of battles and glory. But if you listen closely, very closely, you can almost hear the heartbeat of a forgotten trade, the quiet toil of the shoemakers of Napoleon's Grande Armée. Tonight, let us step softly into their world, not through the thunder of cannons, but through the slower, quieter footsteps of those who followed behind. Imagine a cold morning in the French countryside, sometime in the early 1800s. The sun is still just a thought on the horizon. The grass sparkles with frost. Soldiers, thousands of them, stir from their tents, stretch aching limbs, and prepare to move again. But in one corner of the encampment, a man is already awake. His fingers, calloused and ink-stained from boot dye, reach into a worn leather satchel. He pulls out a curved blade, a small hammer, and a bundle of mismatched laces, and begins the same ritual he's performed 1,000 times before. This man is a cobbler, or, as they were sometimes called, a cordonnier. And though history rarely remembers his name, his work traveled with Napoleon from the vineyards of France to the snows of Russia. Have you ever thought about what happens to a soldier's boots after 100 miles on foot? What about after 500 or 1,000? Leather cracks, soles peel away, nails rust and snap. In peacetime, a worn boot means a visit to the village shoemaker. But in war, especially a war like Napoleon's, which spanned entire continents, a soldier often had only one pair of shoes. And when those shoes failed, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean frostbite, infection, or being left behind. And so, following behind the banners of the emperor, walked or rode in creaking carts the humble shoemakers of the Grande Armée. They weren't clad in bright uniforms or adorned with medals. Their fingers were stained with grease, their trousers patched with old leather, their breath often smelling of pitch and glue. They carried not weapons but awls and rasps, hammers and twine. While others trained in formations and drills, they studied the curve of a heel, the stretch of cowhide, the grain of pigskin. And when battle broke out, while some sought shelter, these cobblers would crouch by candlelight or lean under the awning of a supply wagon, repairing soles as gunpowder clouds drifted above the hills. Life for these craftsmen was a strange mix of routine and chaos. In the lull between battles, they might set up small workspaces beside the fire. Picture it: a low wooden stool, a makeshift table, piles of broken shoes, and strips of salvaged leather curled like autumn leaves. Shoemaking, like soldiering, required patience and resilience. The cobbler would begin by removing old stitching, picking at threads that had turned to dust. Then, using heated irons and tiny wooden pegs, he'd attach a new sole, bending over the work until the smoke from the fire curled around his face like mist. But leather, especially in wartime, was a luxury. The army rarely had enough. Sometimes the shoemakers would barter with locals, offering coins, military scraps, or even labor in exchange for cowhide or goat skin. In desperate times, they would harvest leather from fallen horses, or even grimly from the boots of fallen men. The supply chain was long, slow, and uncertain. A shipment of tanned hides might take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. And yet, the work never stopped. In towns and villages, shoemakers would scavenge abandoned homes for nails and thread. In forested areas, they might soak bark to create a crude form of tanning solution. Some even experimented with old belts, saddlebags, or wineskins. Anything to keep a soldier's feet wrapped and dry. There's something strangely beautiful in this labor, this quiet perseverance. In a world obsessed with battle plans and imperial ambitions, here were men who asked only for enough light to see their stitches, enough heat to soften the leather, and enough time to finish one more pair before the column moved on. Some days, they'd be overwhelmed. Dozens of men lining up, boots in hand, limping from blisters or barefoot entirely. Soldiers grew desperate. One officer wrote home describing how some men wrapped their feet in linen soaked in wax, or in strips of bark held together with twine. A good pair of shoes could buy a man's place near the front of the line, not for glory, but for shelter, rations, or simply mercy. And still the shoemakers worked. They rarely saw the battles themselves, but they heard the stories. In the evenings when soldiers returned, muddy, wounded, and silent, the cobblers would listen. They would nod, say little, and perhaps offer a warm seat by the fire. They didn't ask for much, just time and leather. On occasion, an officer would request a custom pair, more refined, polished, befitting rank. In these moments, the cobbler might allow himself a touch of pride. He'd measure carefully, shape the boot with precision, and rub the surface with oil until it gleamed in the candlelight. These boots might never see mud, but they were crafted with the same care, the same reverence as those worn by the infantry. Have you ever paused to consider how something as simple as a shoe shapes history? A soldier with dry feet marches farther, stands longer, survives winter. The march to Russia, long, cold, and deadly, claimed thousands, not by bullet, but by blisters, frostbite, and collapsed arches. One forgotten shoemaker's timely repair might have carried a man across a frozen bridge, or away from an ambush, or simply back home again. And yet, their names are lost. They didn't write memoirs, they left no portraits. Their tools, if preserved, sit unlabeled in dusty museum drawers. But for a brief moment in time, they were vital threads in the great tapestry of empire. Somewhere in a field near Smolensk, a pair of boots might still lie buried in the soil, the soles stitched by hand, the leather cracked but whole. And within those quiet stitches lies a story of skill, of patience, of quiet devotion to a forgotten craft. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts drift, imagine that camp again. See the smoke curling from the fires. Hear the gentle rustle of canvas in the wind. And there, by the dim glow of coals, see the cobbler, bent over his work, lips moving silently as he threads the needle through yet another broken soul. He hums, perhaps, a tune from home, or maybe just the rhythm of the task. Tap, pull, stitch, tap. Long after the march has begun again, he lingers behind, packing his tools, brushing off the dirt, and wrapping the finished boots in cloth. And as the army fades into the horizon, he walks quietly on. We're not following generals tonight, we're following wool. From the back of a grazing sheep in a sleepy French pasture to the richly dyed cloth that would become the coat of a soldier, we'll walk slowly, softly, through the tactile rhythms of uniform production in early 1800s France. It's a story of hands, of looms, of pots and pulleys and dies that stained the fingers and scented the air. It's a world that moved not with the bang of cannons, but with the creak of spinning wheels and the whisper of shears. You might not have heard of it before, but it's real history. And tonight, it's yours to fall asleep to. So settle in, breathe gently, and let us begin. Imagine, first, the morning fog lifting over a French hillside in springtime. The year is 1807, perhaps. Napoleon is at the height of his power, but here, among the rolling pastures of Normandy or the grassy slopes near Limoges, there is only the slow, familiar rhythm of sheep grazing. You can hear their quiet bleats, the crunch of grass beneath their hooves, and the distant ring of a shepherd's bell carried on the breeze. Each sheep, curled and woolly, is the beginning of a thread. Quite literally. These aren't just any sheep. Over the years, the French government, keen to clothe its armies in consistent, durable uniforms, had encouraged the breeding of better, finer fleeced sheep. There were even attempts to steal or import the prized Spanish merinos, smuggled in under secretive missions to improve the national stock. But tonight, we're not thinking about secret agents or livestock politics. We're here in the dew-speckled field, watching the shepherds move with their quiet confidence, sticks in hand, as the animals are corralled for shearing. And oh, shearing! It's not fast. It's slow, meditative, almost musical in its repetition. A practiced shearer might take 5, maybe 10 minutes per sheep. The blades, large and scissor-like, open and close with a muted snip, snip, snip. The wool falls in soft lanolin-rich curls, warm, earthy, and slightly greasy to the touch. Can you picture the texture? Thick, dense, and a little springy. The beginning of a soldier's coat. From the field, the wool is gathered, bundled into heavy sacks, and sent on its way. But not quickly. The roads are bumpy, the carts are wooden, and horses move at their own pace. Across miles of winding lanes, from farm to spinner, the raw fleece makes its slow journey into the next phase of its transformation. And we go with it. Let's pause now in a small town, perhaps near Rouen, or in the Auvergne, where the spinning of wool has been a trade for generations. In a stone cottage, you might hear the low whir of a spinning wheel turned patiently by foot. A woman, maybe a grandmother, or a young wife with her baby nearby, draws the wool between her fingers, twisting and turning it into yarn. The room smells of lanolin and straw, and the fire in the hearth crackles with gentle warmth. This work, like so much in the world of textiles, is quiet, detailed, and deeply skilled. Every thread must be smooth, every twist even. Do you wonder, perhaps, who these women were? What they thought about day after day, spinning wool that would one day become the clothing of war? Or was it just cloth to them? A livelihood, a tradition. History rarely writes down the names of spinners, but their touch is on every coat. Once spun, the wool becomes yarn, neat and strong and ready for weaving. And so, it travels again, this time to the looms. If you've never stood inside a weaving workshop, let me bring it to life for you. Picture an old timber-framed building, the kind that creaks when the wind blows. Inside, long rhythmic rows of hand looms, each one manned by a weaver, usually male, often working 12 hours or more a day. Clack, clack, clack. The shuttle zips back and forth. The heddles rise and fall. And inch by inch, the wool becomes fabric. This truly is where the wool begins to look like cloth. Thick, tightly woven panels of coarse wool twill, ideal for uniforms. Dark blue for the infantry. Deep green, perhaps, for dragoons. And always that dense, scratchy feel. Durable enough to withstand weather, dirt, and battle. But of course, we aren't quite there yet. The cloth must be dyed. So now we follow it to Lyon. Ah, Lyon. A city that has smelled of dyes and silk for centuries. Even in the early 1800s, it was a place of steaming vats and bubbling pots, where dye masters jealously guarded their recipes and apprentices watched with wide-eyed patience. Natural dyes in those days, indigo from the colonies, madder root for red, oak galls for black. And the dye houses, warm and wet and fragrant, were like kitchens for fabric. Stirring, soaking, rinsing, hanging to dry. A symphony of color and chemistry. Imagine cloth being lowered into a vat of deep blue. The wool soaks up the color slowly, like watching tea steep. Then it's lifted out and hung on long racks to dry in the open air. If the day is sunny, the cloth dries faster. If it's cloudy, it may take longer, all of which affects the final texture. Here, too, we find nameless laborers. Young boys who turn the cloth, older men who check for evenness. Hands stained purple or red or black from years of touching wet dye. You could always tell a dyer by the color of his fingernails. Do you wonder, just gently, how many hands passed across each bolt of uniform cloth? How many workers touched it, folded it, brushed it, pressed it flat before it left Lyon and traveled on? And yet, the journey is not over. The dyed fabric must be cut, sewn, and finished. Transformed from mere material into garments. So let us step now into the quiet world of the military tailors. Not in Paris, no. Most uniform production was outsourced across France. To contract tailors in towns and cities, some working in small ateliers, others in homes, hand-sewing every piece. There's something deeply tactile about this part. You might picture a dim room, lit by afternoon sun slanting through the shutters. A tailor sits at a wide wooden table, chalking outlines onto wool. The scissors are large, heavy. The fabric gives a soft resistance as it's cut, and around the tailor, piles of half-finished coats, sleeves waiting to be attached, collars waiting to be turned. The military uniform of Napoleonic France was not simple. There were brass buttons, often made in separate workshops and sewn on last. There were epaulets, facings, linings, all hand-stitched, usually by apprentices or female assistants, and the work had to be fast. The French army was enormous, hundreds of thousands of men needing coats, breeches, shakoes, and greatcoats. Each one measured, supplied, and replaced again and again. And yet, despite this scale, the process was still deeply human. Think about that for a moment. That something as small as a stitch, made by candlelight, would go on to shape the appearance of one of the most powerful armies in history. A soldier, far from home, cold in winter, might be warmed by a coat that passed through a dozen hands before it ever reached his back. And those hands, mostly forgotten, left behind no monument but the thread they sewed. By the time the coat was delivered, folded, stacked, and ready for distribution, it had traveled across half of France. Wool from the west, spinning from the center, weaving from the north, dyeing in the east, and tailoring in countless towns in between. Isn't it curious to think that Napoleon's army, often seen as a single machine, was actually clothed by a network of ordinary lives? Farmers, dyers, weavers, and cutters, each playing a part in a quiet, steady rhythm of labor. Even the buttons, those tiny glints of brass, had their own journey. Often made from recycled metals cast in small foundries, polished by hand. Buttons were precious. Soldiers would sometimes remove them from fallen uniforms and send them home as tokens. Some families even kept them for years after a son was gone. And so, we come to the final scene. A barracks courtyard. The morning mist is lifting. A line of new recruits stands, arms at their sides, wearing fresh uniforms. The wool is stiff at first. It will soften with wear. The boots creak. The coats fit snugly, though not perfectly. They never did. An officer inspects. He checks the seams. He touches the collar. He looks perhaps not just for discipline, but for unity. And in that moment, all the quiet labor, the spinning wheels, the looms, the dye pots, the sewing needles, comes together in a single breath. You, dear listener, have followed the wool from the field to the front, and not once did it rush. And so now, as you rest, you might let your thoughts wander gently across that invisible thread. From the sheep grazing in the sun, to the humming loom, to the soldier standing still, somewhere far away. The threads of empire woven slowly, stitched not just by strategy and war, but by hands and cloth and care. Have you ever stopped to think about a button? Not the kind on your television or your mobile phone, but a simple button, round, flat, perhaps made of brass, cool to the touch, a small, unassuming object that holds cloth together. It doesn't seem like much. It sits quietly on a coat, often unnoticed, until the moment you need it. But in a certain time in history, in a certain war, in a certain empire, the humble button was anything but ordinary. Close your eyes, if you'd like, and imagine an empire stretched across Europe. Snow-capped mountains, rolling green valleys, dusty roads, and smoky cities. At its heart, a man with a hand tucked into his coat. Napoleon Bonaparte. His armies were vast, numbering over 1 million at their peak. And each man needed a uniform, and each uniform needed buttons. This is not a story of battles or glory, not tonight. This is the quiet story of how a single brass button tried to make its way from a workshop in Lyon to the distant front lines in Prussia, and how it never quite got there. Let's begin in the late spring of 1808. In a small brass shop tucked behind the River Saône in Lyon, the forge glows softly in the early morning. The smith, Monsieur Rémy Duclerc, begins his work before the city stirs. His apron is stiff with use, and the scent of metal dust and oil clings to the air. There's a rhythm to his work, hammering, shaping, dipping, cooling, as he and 2 apprentices produce buttons for the Ministry of War. These aren't decorative trinkets. They are regulation buttons stamped with the eagle of Napoleon's empire. Each must be exactly 23 millimeters across, with a loop shank on the back and 4 raised stars around the border. The brass must shine without glaring. It's a small detail. But in the Grande Armée, details mattered. Rémy produces hundreds each week. They are sorted into wooden boxes lined with felt, counted in batches of 1,200, enough for 100 soldiers. Each box is tied shut with a wax-sealed ribbon bearing the ministry's sigil. The seal, a sleepy-eyed clerk once joked, costs more than the buttons themselves. On May 16, 1808, a box marked Depot of 44 is sealed and stacked among others in Rémy's small storeroom. The clerk who logs it, a balding man named Etienne, sips weak coffee as he signs his initials with a feathered quill. The shipment is scheduled to be collected by mid-June, according to the administrative papers filed in Paris. But as with many things in wartime, schedules are more hope than certainty. And so the box waits. Dust gathers lightly on its lid. Flies buzz around the open windows. Outside, the river moves quietly, reflecting the sunlight like rippling silk. Finally, on June 3rd, a mule-drawn wagon arrives from the quartermaster's bureau. The driver is a red-cheeked man named Louis, who carries a battered leather pouch containing 6 delivery forms and a wedge of hard cheese. He loads 15 crates, Depot A44 among them, and makes for the customs office, where a young inspector slowly checks each seal. Have you ever watched ink dry? That's the pace of bureaucracy. After some grumbling and a misplaced page, the inspector stamps the manifest with a dull thump, and Louis is finally allowed to depart. 2 days behind schedule. The journey to Paris takes over a week, not because of the distance, though the roads are winding, but because each wagon must stop at every departmental checkpoint. Paperwork must be shown, signed, sometimes copied out by hand. One guard captain insists on checking the contents of each box. He opens Depot A44, fingers the brass buttons, shrugs, and seals it again, but not before helping himself to a bite of Louis's cheese. In Paris, the crates are unloaded at a vast warehouse near Les Invalides. Inside, dozens of clerks move slowly among tall stacks of paperwork and wooden pallets. The air smells of damp parchment and lamp oil. Here, Depot of 44 is logged again and rerouted to the Department of Army Textiles, a converted wine cellar beneath the Ministry of War. A young woman named Josephine handles the internal inventory. She's efficient, though the light flickers constantly above her desk. Her fingers are stained with ink, and she works with the quiet calm of someone who long ago accepted that the numbers will never quite add up. She notices that A44 was supposed to arrive 10 days ago. She notes it, but says nothing. It's not the worst delay she's seen. By late June, the shipment is approved for movement eastward, toward the staging grounds in Metz, near the German border. But here, the trail begins to blur. The war in Spain has strained the empire's resources. Carts are harder to come by. Horses are being requisitioned daily. Paper is in short supply, and many transport requests are now written on scraps or reused bills. Depot A44 is placed on a new manifest, hastily written by a sleepy assistant named Pierre, and scheduled to depart with a convoy of supply wagons on July 3rd. But on July 2nd, it rains. The roads turn to sludge. 2 wagons overturn outside of Nancy. Another is commandeered by a passing general who insists his wine be delivered to his summer villa before any army provisions. Our crate of buttons, packed securely in the back of a 4th wagon, reaches Metz by July 12th. But there's a problem. The receiving officer, Colonel Delacour, cannot find a matching manifest. The ink has smeared. Depot A44 looks to his eye like A41, which already arrived last week. Rather than risk the wrath of the auditors and their endless probing questions, he sends the box to a secondary depot outside Verdun for further clarification. It is now mid-July. The sun is hot. The road is dusty. Soldiers are moving, marching, drilling. But the box sits still, in a tent. Flies return. The wax seal is intact, but a corner of the crate is beginning to warp from the heat. Inside the box, the brass buttons rest quietly, still gleaming in the dark. They don't know they're late. They don't know they're needed. At the front, in the east, soldiers are stitching coats with mismatched fasteners. Some use bone buttons, others use thread knots. One unit, it is said, fights with no fasteners at all, using pins borrowed from camp laundresses. Morale suffers, though no one blames the laundresses. By August, Depot A44 is temporarily lost. Not stolen, not destroyed, just misfiled. It appears briefly in a ledger in Reims, then vanishes again. The crate is mistaken for artillery fittings, then for medical supplies, then for a box of campaign medals that no one remembers awarding. It passes through 2 more hands, neither of whom open it, before being stored in a barn outside Strasbourg as unconfirmed inventory autumn. Weeks pass. The war shifts. Autumn arrives. Leaves fall. The barn is cold now. By November, the war in Prussia has reached a stalemate. Supplies are critically low. A fresh order of buttons is sent from Lyon, this time by river barge. Faster, more direct. A new shipment of 60 crates makes it to the front in only 4 weeks. Depot A44 is forgotten, but not forever. In the spring of 1809, a new quartermaster named Lucien, young, eager, and unusually curious, is tasked with cataloging abandoned inventory near the Rhine. He discovers the barn outside Strasbourg and, with some effort, opens the swollen door. Dust billows out. Mice scatter. Inside, he finds several crates, some broken, others sealed. He pries open Depot A44. Inside, 1,200 perfectly preserved brass buttons. He frowns. The seal dates them to the previous year. They are now considered obsolete. Uniforms have changed slightly, and the eagle emblem has been adjusted to face left instead of right. Regulations are strict. Even buttons must conform. Still, Lucien files a report. The crate is labeled as surplus decorative hardware and assigned to a warehouse in Mainz, where it sits for another 2 years. By 1811, it is auctioned to a private tailor. The tailor, Jules, uses the buttons to make ornate coats for minor nobility in Baden. He has no idea they were once intended for war. He just likes the gleam. And so, dear listener, that is how a single box of brass buttons meant for soldiers of an empire took a quiet, meandering journey across France, never reaching its original destination. But perhaps that's the strange magic of history. Not every object becomes what it was meant to be. Not every shipment arrives. Not every plan survives the parchment it's written on. Sometimes the tiniest things, like a box of buttons, drift through time, quietly gathering stories of their own. Have you ever wondered how many things we wear, or hold, or forget began as part of something else entirely? How many coats still carry the glint of buttons once made for war? How many buttons lying quietly in drawers or stitched into old jackets once traveled dusty roads and dark barns, only to be forgotten and then remembered again? And if you're ever buttoning up your coat on a cold morning, perhaps you'll think, just for a moment, about the journey of that little circle of brass, and how sometimes even the smallest objects hold echoes of empires and of promises, quietly broken. There's a kind of silence that only winter can bring. It's not the quiet of absence or loneliness. It's the hush of a world wrapped in white. Snow muffles the sound of footsteps. Breath turns to mist. And time, somehow, seems to slow. Now, imagine that silence stretching for miles, across an endless plain. Imagine standing in a field where the snow is not new, but hard and gray and bitter with cold, where the wind doesn't whistle but rasps, like dry cloth drawn slowly across ice, where even the birds have left, and the only sound is the crunch of thousands of boots plodding westward. This is not the battlefield, not the chaos of musket fire or the thunder of cannons. This is something quieter, more creeping, more patient. This is the story of how frostbite arrived, long before the bullets. So, if you're resting now, lying back, eyes soft, body relaxed, allow me to gently take you back to a winter long past, back to the year 1812, to a cold that broke armies, and to a silence that swallowed one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Not in a single moment, but in a slow, soft, white unraveling. By the late autumn of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was already far deeper into Russian territory than he had intended. His Grande Armée, once numbering over 600,000 men, had advanced eastward in pursuit of glory, supplies, and strategy. But Moscow, their target, had offered no victory. Only a hollow shell of a city, abandoned, smoldering, silent. The Tsar refused to negotiate, the Russians refused to surrender, and winter refused to wait. As November crept across the land, the army began its retreat westward. The wind picked up, the snow thickened, and the cold changed. At first, it was only a matter of discomfort. Soldiers bundled their collars. They joked, weakly, about the Russian chill. They tightened their boots and stomped their feet. They spoke of warm hearths at home, of mother's soups and the kiss of sunshine. They believed they would outpace the cold, just as they had tried to outpace the Russians. But the frost was not chasing them. It was waiting. Waiting in the cracks of their boots. Waiting in the sweat-soaked linings of their coats. Waiting in the spaces between their fingers and the folds behind their knees. You see, frostbite does not announce itself. It does not roar. It whispers. In the early days of the retreat, medical officers trained in the knowledge of wounds, of broken bones, of musket shot and saber slashes began to notice something curious in the field logs. Cases marked simply as insensibilité, numbness, toes that no longer tingled, fingers that bent stiffly, if at all. Soldiers who reported no pain, but also no feeling. One such officer, Jean-Marie Duguay, wrote in his journal on November 8th, "They do not complain of injury, only that their fingers behave like wax. Some carry them in their pockets like dead birds." At first, the cases were rare, a few in each company. Men who had perhaps fallen behind or slept too close to the ice. But the logs grew, and the frost crept further. The soldiers adapted as they could. They tore strips of linen from shirts. They wrapped their feet in hay, in straw, in whatever dry material could be scavenged. Some tucked horsehair into their sleeves for insulation. Others pulled gloves over raw hands and urinated on them, hoping the warmth would return life to the fingers. But frostbite does not negotiate. Now, let your mind drift for a moment to the image of a camp at dusk. The sky is bruised purple, and the snow reflects a dying blue light. Tents flap lazily in the wind, if they exist at all. Many have none. Fires are rare. Wood is precious. Men sleep huddled like spoons in an open bowl. A soldier named Pierre, no more than 23, lies with his boots still on. They are crusted with ice and salt. His socks have fused to his skin. In the morning, Pierre does not feel his left foot. Not because it's missing, but because it's gone in another way. Frozen, waxy, unresponsive. The field surgeon touches it with a pin, no reaction. Later, they will cut it away. Not with precision, but with desperation. Pierre does not scream, not because he is brave, but because his body has forgotten how to feel it. Such moments were not rare, and still, they marched. Let's pause here, dear listener, and let me ask you gently, have you ever felt cold that seems to reach inside you, like it remembers who you are? Cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but listens for your heartbeat and slows it? That was the cold of 1812. Not the crisp winter air of a snow-covered postcard, but the historical cold, the kind that fills the footnotes of forgotten diaries. In one such diary, written in a looping, careful French hand, an unnamed infantryman wrote, "I would have given a year of my life for a potato, not to eat, but to hold in my hands." They were small thoughts like this, that marked the difference between those who suffered and those who would not wake. Some units fared better than others. The Polish regiments, for instance, had experience with harsh winters. They taught others how to layer with dry materials, how to keep moving in the night, and how to breathe through scarves to keep the lungs from freezing. But even knowledge has its limits. Horses died by the dozens. Carts froze to the ground. Gunpowder became unreliable. The mighty cannons, once Napoleon's pride, had to be abandoned. Their wheels frozen solid, their iron bodies brittle with cold. In one report, a soldier tried to light a fire beneath the barrel of a cannon, hoping to loosen its ice-welded axles. The barrel cracked. This, more than any battle, was the great disarmament of the Grande Armée. And what of the officers? They too suffered. Though they often rode instead of marched, they could not escape the frost. General Armand de Caulaincourt, Napoleon's trusted aide, recorded with heartbreaking precision what he saw. Each morning, I witnessed men frozen in sleep, eyes open, hands curled like claws. They did not move when the column passed by. No one could bury the dead. The ground was too hard. Sometimes a thin dusting of snow would be brushed over a fallen man, a kind of blanket, a kind of farewell. But more often, they simply remained, sitting against tree trunks, lying in ditches, their bodies half curled, as if dreaming. Still, there were moments of strange beauty. Sunrises were pale and luminous. The frost turned tree branches to glass. Icicles formed like cathedral spires from tents and cart edges. The silence was complete, so complete that men began to whisper more, as though afraid to break it. In the quiet, you could hear the ticking of a watch from meters away. You could hear snowflakes landing on cloth. You could hear the slow, steady breath of a man trying to stay alive. Napoleon himself rode in a closed carriage by this time, not for comfort, but for survival. Even the emperor was not immune. He had planned to outrun the winter, to turn and fight, to return to Paris with tales of victory. But instead, his thoughts turned inward, to logistics, to silence, to the realization that cold was not an enemy one could negotiate with. He would later say, "The cold was the only general I could not defeat." By mid-December, when the surviving portion of the army crossed the Berezina River, a freezing, terrible passage made under Russian fire, fewer than 100,000 remained. Of those, perhaps half were combat capable. The rest, well, they had given pieces of themselves to the cold. Some would live long lives, but with missing fingers or blackened feet. Others would never quite warm up again, even in summer. They would carry an inner frost, and some quietly on the road west would lie down in the snow one night and simply not wake. Not from gunshot, not from glory, but from a soft white silence. So what can we take from this? Why remember frost-bitten fingers and snowbound feet? Perhaps because history is not only made in battles and treaties, but in quiet acts of survival, in a strip of cloth tied around a toe, in the warmth of a shared blanket, in the breath of a soldier still trying to stand, and perhaps, too, because defeat does not always come with a bang. Sometimes it comes slowly, inch by inch. as the feeling fades from your hands, as you drift now and let the weight of the day fall away. Remember that even the greatest empires were once brought low by the simplest forces, not by fire, not by steel, but by cold air, by wet socks, by winter wind. And in those small moments, in the straw-wrapped toes and the whispered songs in the dark, we find the fragile human core of history. Not heroic, not tragic, just real. Tonight, we won't be charging into battle. Tonight, we'll follow the quieter side of history, the kind that rarely makes it into textbooks. We'll drift gently into the frost-bitten footprints of an army not defined by its weapons, but by its kettles. Its victories weren't always won by bayonets, but by biscuits. This is the story of soup before strategy, of fire before formation, of how the warmth of a single pot could sometimes matter more than the sound of a general's trumpet. So settle in. Let the cold of the past stay outside your door and come closer to the gentle rhythm of routine, to men who boiled, stirred, rationed, waited, and hoped. Picture, if you will, a bleak morning on the Polish plains in the winter of 1812. The air is gray and uncooperative, smelling of damp canvas and tired horses. Snow falls without elegance, thick, wet, and constant, sticking to everything and softening the world into a silent haze. In a makeshift camp stretched across a muddy hillside, the soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Armée begin their day. There's no bugle, no call to arms, only the gentle crackle of a few sparse fires, and the quieter stillness of men too hungry to speak. Their uniforms are heavy with dampness. Their boots, if they have them, are stiff with ice. And yet, even in this desolate cold, there's a ritual, a calm choreography repeated every morning. One soldier leans over a small fire, carefully adding twigs, dried the night before in his armpit to keep them from freezing. Another empties a leather satchel of its contents, a few hard biscuits, a pinch of salt, and a single shriveled onion. A third man, older, slower, unslings a battered tin pot from his bag. Its bottom is blackened from weeks of campfires, its handle mended with wire. This is breakfast. Or perhaps more truthfully, it is what stands in for it. And for these men, it is everything. We often imagine armies in terms of tactics and maneuvers. Arrows on maps, charges across fields, commanders bellowing orders. But the true spine of any army, especially one that marches thousands of miles like Napoleon's, was not made of strategy. It was made of calories. In the long months of the Russian campaign, it wasn't the bullets that brought the army to its knees. It was the lack of broth. Now, let's slow down and consider this. When the Grande Armée crossed into Russia in the summer of 1812, it was the largest European military force ever assembled. Over 600,000 men marched under Napoleon's eagle. But among the wagons of ammunition, cannons, and maps, there was a far more valuable cargo: food. Or at least, there was supposed to be. The army carried with it hundreds of thousands of rations, dried biscuits known as pain de munition, made from coarse flour and baked hard enough to survive months without spoiling. There was salt pork, thick slabs of fatty meat cured to last the journey. Barley, dried peas, a few bricks of chocolate and brandy to keep spirits high. And yet, within weeks, this carefully planned supply system began to crumble. Wagons broke down in the mud. Horses died by the hundreds. Local villages were stripped bare, and foraging parties returned empty-handed more often than not. Soon the men turned to boiling leather straps. They made soup from twigs, and their dreams turned almost obsessively to the simple, steaming comfort of stew. Let's linger for a while on this image. Not the drama of retreat, not the frost-bitten marches, but the quiet hour between waking and walking, when food, or the lack of it, became the central focus of every soldier's life. In every camp, no matter how short-lived, there was an unspoken order of business. First, fire, then food. Only then, fight. A soldier might skip his prayers. He might miss roll call. But he would not miss a chance to warm his hands over a fire, waiting for his pot to boil. There's something timeless about it, isn't there? That deeply human instinct to seek warmth, to gather, to stir and wait, to share a meal, however small. The logistics of cooking in the field were strange and often absurd. Many men had no pots of their own. They improvised with helmets, with broken tin cups, or the curved belly of a discarded cannonball casing. Water had to be melted from snow, filtered through cloth to remove ash or insects. Salt was so precious, it was divided into thimblefuls. A soldier might barter half his week's ration just for a spoonful of fat, to give his stew some body. There are records of men dreaming aloud as they stirred their makeshift kettles. If I had but a clove of garlic, I'd be king for the day. If only the pork had a little more pig in it. We may lose the war, but if this soup boils, I'll count it a victory. And maybe they weren't entirely joking. After all, a warm meal could mean the difference between marching or collapsing, between a man shivering in silence or singing to himself to stay awake. One soldier, a grenadier named Bouchard, wrote in his letters home that the thing he missed most wasn't the presence of family or the comfort of bed. It was the smell of his mother's kitchen. He remembered the way she would let lentils bubble for hours on the hearth, how she'd toss in a sprig of thyme, something he hadn't smelled in months, and how the broth would grow thicker by the minute, coating the back of a wooden spoon like velvet. Out here, his own soup was more like a memory, but he still stirred it with care, because to stir the pot was to stir a little hope back into life. By the time December came, Napoleon's army was no longer an army in any traditional sense. It was a collection of frozen ghosts, drifting westward, ragged, frost-bitten, and silent. But even then, there were still fires, still pots, still men who waited for water to boil, even if all they had to add was a pinch of snow and a silent prayer. There's a quiet nobility in this, don't you think? In the man who, despite the horrors around him, still insists on soup, who still kneels before a tiny fire and watches the bubbles rise, who still believes in the value of warmth, no matter how small. We are taught that armies move on their feet, but perhaps more truthfully, they move on their bellies, on the heat of a spoonful of lentils, on the comfort of a biscuit softened by broth, on the rare, miraculous moment when a crust of bread becomes, for a moment, sacred. And now, let the image settle in your mind. A winter camp, quiet, still, a dozen fires flickering low in the snow, men wrapped in blankets, sharing silence. Above them, the sky is thick with stars. Below, their boots steam faintly from the warmth of the fire. A pot bubbles gently. Someone hums. Someone sleeps. Not every soldier dreams of battle. Some dream only of stew. And isn't that just as noble? Isn't that, in its own small way, heroic? So now, as your own night deepens, as your breath slows and your body softens into rest, think not of the wars won or lost, but of the men who boiled water first, of the ones who made soup before strategy, who knew that sometimes survival is not about conquering, but simply about warming your hands on a pot that still miraculously simmers. Once upon a time, this unremarkable wool became something quite extraordinary, not for its quality, but for its sudden and startling absence. This is the story of a crisis you've likely never heard of. There were no fiery battles, no declarations, no grand treaties. It unfolded quietly, invisibly, across fields and ports, tailor shops and army camps. It was 1812, the thick of the Napoleonic Wars, and Europe had run out of wool. Now, perhaps this doesn't sound like much of a crisis. Wool, after all, is just a fabric. It doesn't roar like a cannon or shine like polished steel. It's not the stuff of military glory. But if you pause for a moment and think about what an army truly needs, not only to fight, but to survive, you'll see how wool lies at the very heart of war. Every soldier's uniform, every cloak, every pair of socks, every blanket, every lining of a saddlebag. In 1812, almost all of these were made from wool, and without it, cold crept in. Morale wore thin, and far from the thrones and battlefields, a quiet unraveling began. Let's go back now, slowly, gently. Let's walk into that moment in time. The year is 1812. The winds of war have been blowing for over a decade. Napoleon's empire stretches across most of continental Europe. British ships prowl the seas, enforcing their infamous blockade, the Orders in Council, hoping to starve France into submission by cutting off its trade. In return, Napoleon closes the continent to British goods in what he calls the Continental System. The goal is economic ruin, but the consequences are oddly practical. It's not just gold or tea that gets scarce, it's thread, dyes, felt, spindles, and, most pressingly, wool. Picture now the hillsides of England, Scotland, and Spain, once teeming with sheep, now sheared earlier and more often than ever. Fleeces barely had time to grow. The wool came off thin, fragile. Still, it was carted off to workshops by candlelight. Women and children spun by hand. Clothiers boiled and dyed the thread, but without good indigo from the colonies or cochineal from Spain, the colors came out wrong. Dull, muddy, sometimes sickly green or gray. The French couldn't get British wool. The British couldn't get French dyes. Smugglers tried to sneak materials through, but the wars made it slow and perilous. And so uniforms, those proud symbols of national might, became mottled, scratchy, and unreliable. It's strange, isn't it, to think of a soldier pulling on his uniform not with pride but with dread. The sleeves too tight, the cuffs too short, the collar chafing because it's been stitched from a dozen different bolts of cloth. In some regiments, old uniforms were turned inside out, the outer layer too frayed to face the world. Others were patched so many times their original color was only a memory. And then there were the underlayers, the things no one sees. Stockings full of holes, undergarments that never dried properly, greatcoats so threadbare they might as well have been canvas, blankets that held no warmth. In the frigid Russian campaign later that same year, these shortages would become fatal. Men froze not just from the cold, but from lack of preparation, because there simply wasn't enough wool to go around. But the story of this shortage didn't begin on the battlefield. It began quietly, in places far from glory. Let's pause and walk through one of them. Imagine a dye house in Rouen, France. The year again is 1812. The workshop smells of vinegar and soot. In one corner, a vat bubbles slowly, giving off the sharp, earthy scent of crushed madder root. It was a common red dye, used when more expensive ingredients were no longer affordable. The dye master, a stooped man with red-stained fingernails, dips a skein of yarn into the vat. He stirs it with a wooden pole, slowly, patiently. He sighs. The color's uneven. There's not enough alum for proper mordanting. The dye won't hold. This red will fade in weeks. The soldiers wearing it may be proud for a moment, but their jackets will turn pink in the rain. Or worse, a sort of rusted orange. Still, it must do. There is nothing else. Elsewhere in Yorkshire, a spinner looks out the window at the sheep fields. The flocks are smaller this year. Disease has spread unnoticed. The best breeds have been over-sheared. The wool isn't long enough for combing, so it must be carded and used for weft, not warp. The yarn will be weaker. She knows what that means. Fraying, snagging, split seams, and soon some soldier on the other side of the channel will curse the stitchwork in the rain. Have you ever noticed how many tiny, invisible hands go into a single shirt? Every fiber carded, every thread twisted, every stitch drawn. How quickly we forget them. And yet, when those hands are tired, or rushed, or simply can't get the right materials, even a shirt becomes a kind of omen. And now, picture the tailors. They worked in narrow, dimly lit rooms, not the romantic shops of novels, but damp spaces above stables or behind bakeries, in Vienna, in Milan, in Krakow. Wherever armies mustered, there were tailors, hunched over crooked tables, measuring uniforms for boys not much older than their own sons. But now, the bolts of cloth were shorter than the orders called for. The buttons were tin instead of brass, and the thread snapped if pulled too tightly. So the tailors made do. They cheated seams. They cut patterns smaller. They invented clever folds and pleats to hide shortages. Sometimes they used wool from old funeral shrouds, brushed clean and re-dyed. Sometimes they turned draper's cloth, meant for window curtains, into overcoats. One wonders, when the cannon fired and the drums rolled, did anyone stop to think about these small deceits? Did a soldier marching through snow know that the lining in his coat had once hung above a merchant's hearth? Probably not. But the cold knew. The snow didn't care. There were attempts to fix the crisis. In Prussia, state farms were ordered to increase sheep production. In France, a new law allowed officers to requisition wool directly from rural weavers. Even Napoleon himself, with his legendary micromanagement, tried to design simpler uniforms that used less cloth. He failed. And as with all shortages, substitutes appeared. In some garrisons, soldiers wore linen lined with scraps of wool. But linen doesn't insulate. In winter, it freezes. In summer, it clings. Others tried felts mixed with horsehair or worsted cotton soaked in wax, neither of which held up in rain. And then came the paints. Oh yes, the painted uniforms. In desperation, some coats were painted with red or blue to simulate the proper color. It flaked in the sun, it smelled awful, and when it rained, it stained the skin beneath. But it looked presentable from a distance, and that was all that mattered. The illusion of readiness. It's strange, isn't it? How much effort goes into appearing ready, even when the truth is quite the opposite. In Spain, guerrilla fighters wore whatever they could find. A red sash from a looted officer's chest, a woolen cloak stolen from a dead courier. Their makeshift gear was oddly symbolic, a patchwork of war itself. Bits and pieces from everywhere, stitched into something serviceable. In Britain, warehouses filled with uniforms made for regiments that no longer existed. The cloth was good, but it couldn't be repurposed fast enough, so it sat, collecting dust, while newly raised units marched in half-finished gear. Meanwhile, wool prices soared. A bolt of quality wool, once a staple of village markets, now cost more than some soldiers earned in a year. Black market traders thrived. So did thieves. Entire carts of uniforms went missing on country roads. Some were sold. Others simply dismantled. The wool respun into civilian coats for winter. Back at the front, soldiers adapted. They lined their boots with straw, stuffed torn gloves with paper, shared blankets in shifts. They were inventive, resourceful, but still, they were cold. In Russia, the bitter frost of 1812 bit deeply. Men froze in their sleep, horses collapsed, fingers blackened, and all across Napoleon's Grande Armée, the uniforms that had once made them look invincible gave way, thread by thread. Wool, it turned out, was not just a fabric, it was survival. And so, the story of the wool crisis is not about fashion or logistics or even supply lines. It's about all the unseen things that make survival possible. About the farmers who sheared early because they had to. About the dyers who boiled madder when they couldn't afford cochineal. About the tailors who worked by lamplight, rationing thread. About the soldiers who wore their uniforms until they fell apart, and then marched on anyway. It's a reminder, in its own soft way, that even the quietest materials can shape the fate of empires. That every greatcoat has a story, every stitch a compromise, and every crisis, even one as forgotten as this, leaves a subtle mark. So now, as the night grows quiet around you, and your thoughts drift gently like smoke from a hearth, think of wool, plain, itchy, ordinary. But once it was everything. Have you ever thought about socks? Not the new ones tucked in your drawer, not the cozy ones you might slip on before bed, but old socks, worn by soldiers, slowly unraveling with each step. Wool scratchy from wear, heels thinned out, toes poking through. Tonight, we are going to drift, ever so gently, into a peculiar corner of history. Not a battlefield, not a grand throne room, but somewhere far quieter. A place where the stakes were soft and scratchy and small. We'll be walking beside tired men in old boots. Boots that once held warm socks, then held torn ones, then none at all. Let's take a slow breath and imagine the early winter winds of 1812. The air is thin and stinging. Your boots creak as you walk, slowly, stiffly, down a path that stretches endlessly across snow-laced Russian plains. The sky is gray, not stormy, but tired. The kind of gray that seems to hum. Snow crunches faintly underfoot, and each step brings with it a new awareness of cold, of rubbing, of blister, of skin. Because tonight's story is about socks, about how something so small, so mundane, so ordinary could quietly break an army. Napoleon Bonaparte, as you may know, had lofty dreams. In 1812, he marched east with over 500,000 soldiers, men from France, Poland, Germany, Italy, an empire stitched together by ambition. They carried muskets, canteens, wool coats, and most of them, at least in the beginning, wore socks. But how many socks does it take to clothe an army? Let's slow down and think about that for a moment. Each soldier needs at least 2 pairs, ideally more. One to wear, one to dry. 500,000 men. That's 1,000,000 socks. And that's just the start. Because socks wear out. They wear out fast. Especially when you're marching, day after day, over mud, rock, ice, snow. You see, in those days, military logistics wasn't just about gunpowder and horses. It was also about linen and wool. There were officers whose entire job was to track textiles. They counted buttons. They measured greatcoats. And yes, they kept tallies on socks. Somewhere, far from the front lines, there was a man in a candlelit office with ink-stained fingers, scratching numbers in a leather-bound ledger. Paris Depot, June 1812. 230,000 pairs of socks issued. 112,000 pairs remaining in stores. Note, Polish contingent arriving without full uniform requisition. Shortfall of 28,000 pairs. Even before the march had truly begun, the socks were running low. Why? Because wool was precious, because feet were many, and because, in the frenzy of preparing for war, nobody really thought about how quickly socks could vanish. They wore out. They tore. They got soaked in river crossings. They froze stiff overnight. A letter survives, written by a French quartermaster named Boucheron. It's short, quietly desperate. The rate of attrition is alarming. Entire companies report bare feet inside boots. We have resorted to issuing linen strips. The men call them phantom socks. Phantom socks. Just imagine that. Winding thin cloth around your feet. Fooling your mind for a moment into thinking you're warm. But frost doesn't care about pretending. It finds the smallest crack, the thinnest patch, the tiniest hole in the toe. Now picture a soldier, Let's call him Luke. He's from a small town near Bordeaux. Used to work with barrels, crafting casks for wine. When he was conscripted, he brought with him 3 pairs of socks. 1 wool, 1 linen. 1 knitted by his mother from leftover yarn. The wool ones, they lasted a few weeks. The linen, not built for cold. And his mother's? Well, he kept them in his satchel, folded tight, wrapped in paper. Too precious to wear, too thin to help. One morning, in the marshy outskirts of Smolensk, Luke wrote in his journal, still preserved in a military archive in France. My boots bleed color onto my feet. I can feel the leathers bite. Jean wrapped moss into his soles today. We are all inventors of comfort now. Inventors of comfort. How gentle and how sad. Soldiers began tearing apart old uniforms to fashion makeshift socks. Some used strips from their undershirts. Others begged local villagers for scraps. There were even reports, soft and unverified, that some men cut linings from their own greatcoats, trading warmth from the shoulders for a little mercy on the toes. And still the frost crept in. Doctors with the Grande Armée began noticing blackened toes, purple heels, then the smell. A sweet, rotting odor that clung to the skin. Frostbite, gangrene, and slowly amputation. But the worst, some said, wasn't the pain. It was the silence. A surgeon's diary from October 1812 tells of a young man who lost 3 toes, but cried only when his boots were returned to him. Still empty, still sockless. It makes you wonder, how much can a foot endure before the body gives up? How far can someone walk when each step scrapes flesh from bone? And how many soldiers sat by a frozen fire one night, staring at the inside of their boots, whispering the same quiet thought, I used to have socks. Let's pause here. Take a breath. Imagine a candle flickering in a tent, the wax softening slowly, the flame dancing gently against canvas. Inside, an officer sits, cross-legged, sewing together 2 halves of an old blanket, trying to make socks. He's no tailor. The stitches are crooked. The shape is wrong. But the fabric is warm, and warm is enough. By November, the supply lines had collapsed. The snow fell harder, and the last remaining sock depots had been looted. There's a list, dated November 17th, scribbled by a desperate quartermaster. Stock report, Krasny outpost. Bread, 12 loaves. Cartridges, 470. Wool socks, 0. Linen scraps, 3 pounds. 1 box of lavender oil, unused. Lavender oil, a strange relic among the ruin, likely meant to soothe wounds, or perhaps to mask the smell of rotting feet. Small details like these, lavender oil, phantom socks, blanket stitches, remind us that even in grand stories, history is built from the quiet, overlooked things. You see, when the Russian campaign failed, historians spoke of the cold, of the long retreat, of the burned cities. But there was another enemy, soft, slow, and woven from yarn, or rather, from the lack of it, the failure to supply socks. Not glamorous, not dramatic, contributed quietly but profoundly to frostbite, to infections, to demoralization. One captain, a Bavarian attached to Napoleon's forces, wrote in late December somewhere near the Berezina River, "We crossed the water barefoot, ice clung to our skin, and no man spoke. The silence was heavier than the snow." There's something haunting in that image. Men with muskets, men trained for war, men who'd seen cannon fire and battlefields, now brought low by missing socks. Of course, it wasn't just Napoleon's army. Throughout history, soldiers have struggled with foot care. In the American Civil War, entire chapters were written about foot rot. In World War I, trench foot became so common that whole battalions lost mobility. But in 1812, with no antibiotics, no mass-manufactured wool blends, the loss of socks wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. The foot was, in many ways, the first weapon of the army. Without it, no march, no escape, no retreat. And as Napoleon's army limped home, few remembered the officers with ledgers, the quartermasters with frayed supply maps, the local women who sold worn cloth for pennies, the men who wrapped moss in their boots. But they mattered. They mattered so much. So tonight, as you rest, and maybe curl your toes beneath your blanket, spare a thought for the unseen fabric of history, for the cold foot in the frozen boot, for the whispered wish for warmth, for the silent, unsung importance of socks. Because sometimes the smallest comforts are the first to be lost, and the last to be mourned. Sleep well now, and may your feet always stay warm.